Hello, I'm Jurgita Vicheka, Commercial Director at Euromonitor International. Today I'm joined by my colleague Shane MacGuill, Global Lead for Nicotine and Cannabis, to discuss the drivers of environmental sustainability regulation in tobacco and cannabis industries, its role and implications on businesses and consumers. Tackling environmental challenges are top of the sustainability agenda for governments, with countries around the world setting targets and regulations, and companies from every sector being encouraged to increase business transparency and accountability via mandatory ESG reporting. Although some companies and sectors are acting ahead of regulation, legislation has become a vital mechanism to regulate businesses' behaviors, protect local communities, consumers, employees, and the environment. Shane, today we are discussing the impact of sustainability regulations on two industries: tobacco, that often has a pre existing bad guy image, and cannabis, which in opposite is often perceived as a more natural and sustainable endeavor with assumingly lesser impact on environment. What do you think of these perceptions, and what sense do they make in the environmental sustainability context?
Hi, Gita. Thanks very much. Well, I think in the context of sustainability, the short answer is perhaps not a lot of sense. I mean, it's obviously true, and we all know that tobacco consumption is very damaging. Tobacco growing and production also environmentally damaging too. But I mean, it's one agricultural supply chain amongst many globally, and so I think from that point of view, it makes a relatively small impact in terms of the environmental damage. When you place it against all of the other types of agricultural commodity that there is globally, etc. So it's certainly true to say that from a consumption point of view, its impact is outsized. But I think from a sustainability point of view, it's probably in line with other industries or activities of its type. Cannabis, on the other hand, as you advert to correctly, is perceived certainly as eco-friendly. I think a lot of the uptake in consumption we're seeing in terms of the modern cannabis industry is coming from people who see cannabis as a more natural alternative. And there's certainly that kind of perception around it. But actually, in terms of the way cannabis is predominantly produced in the modern world, it's actually incredibly environmentally damaging. And if we look to the US, because the US is where the bulk of the production of cannabis is happening at the moment. About 90% of the cannabis there is grown indoors. That's obviously a form of production in terms of the legal market that's incredibly resource intensive. You look at energy, water use, etc. So there's a real problem really with the sustainability of cannabis that isn't perhaps recognized in terms of the way it's perceived by the consumer or even by regulators to this point to some extent.
Okay. Well, there is an expectation of more stringent sustainability regulations across all industries. What are the most pressing environmental challenges in tobacco and cannabis that drive these regulations?
Yeah, so I would say for both of the industries, the issues are broadly similar across each. So you have the kind of production side of it, the leaf production, either tobacco or cannabis leaf, in terms of the raw material of the driving the industry. A lot of issues around the supply chain and the impact that's produced by that, and then you filter downstream in terms of the value chain and look at the product itself and the packaging around the product. So those three areas really are where in each case focus will be. More specifically on the tobacco side, you've got issues like deforestation and water use in terms of leaf production, where a lot of focus is going. You've got things like carbon emissions in terms of the production, distribution of the products, so from factories and distribution channels, etc. And then probably again most prominently currently waste from the product itself, so disposal of cigarette butts, or if you look at the newer type of products that the industry is moving across to, electronic cigarettes, heated tobacco products, where there's a kind of different kind of waste being generated there, and the industry has to kind of reckon with how to deal with that. From a cannabis point of view, as I've mentioned, indoor cultivation is really the kind of issue here. So you've got massive energy and water use in terms of grow ops there. And I think we'll talk a little bit more in a moment about really the kind of depth or scale of that problem potentially. You've also got an issue with packaging in the cannabis space. If you look at the US market, there's a understandably and rightly, there's a big focus on child-proof packaging and making sure that products don't get into the hands of children and can't be used by children. The sort of corollary or unintended consequence of that, of course, is that a lot of that packaging becomes bulky, unrecyclable, etc. So there's an issue there, particularly as volumes increase in the market. And then similar to tobacco, what we're seeing in cannabis is migration across from a more traditional format, in the case of cannabis flower, into newer kind of infused and extracted formats, and they bring their own kind of sustainability issues from a product point of view. So again, we're seeing the use of vapes in the cannabis world. You have things like beverages coming through now, and they all bring their own problems in terms of packaging materials and the sustainability of the product itself.
Oh, well, thank you. Let's dig into some of these challenges. So, you've already mentioned the manufacturing and supply of tobacco products is often regarded as the most environmentally damaging stage of the industry, with the environmental cost of tobacco manufacturing on occasion being used as a rationale for tobacco control regulation. What are the regulations targeting other tobacco supply chain activities?
Yeah, so it's undoubtedly true that that is one of the most harmful parts of the tobacco industry in terms of manufacturing supply, and we do see a lot of focus on it. So there was a 2017 report from the WHO, for example, that focused on the environmental impact of tobacco in the supply chain and so on. So there's a lot of focus there, perhaps not a lot of regulatory activity right now on the supply chain itself. And I think, partly that's because, that focus or that attention is still building to a certain extent and hasn't filtered fully down through to regulators. And also partly because companies, and again, I think we'll touch on this perhaps a little bit later, but because companies do some self-regulation in this space as well, which up to now has been, useful in terms of persuading regulators to step back or stay out of the fray for the moment. But we are starting to see some measures filtering through. So if you look at something like deforestation, which is an issue in tobacco growing, you know, from two points of view, really, because a in certain areas there's an increased demand for tobacco, and forests are being stripped to provide land to cultivate that tobacco on. But there's also one of the ways of curing tobacco is through fire curing, and deforestation is happening in order to supply that side of the process as well. So we've seen things like the UK Environment Act, more recently the German Supply Chain Act, um, requiring companies, not specifically tobacco companies, but companies in general, requiring them to ensure that deforestation is not happening within their own supply chains. Um, there's also been talk of at EU level a similar type of measure being brought in. And we could see that type of measure kind of focus more specifically on something like tobacco in time as well. In terms of emissions targets from supply chain activities in tobacco, we haven't seen anything yet really on that. And as I said, that may be because the companies kind of have relatively robust targets themselves, which have managed to kind of forestall that for the moment.
Okay. Well, looks like there's much work to do still in this space. Um, let's talk about cannabis. You mentioned already as well, and we know that the vast majority of legal cannabis, around 90%, is grown in indoor cultivation facilities. What is the environmental impact of this production method, and how is it being regulated right now?
Yeah, so the impact is potentially massive. In some ways, it's difficult to overstate the potential impact of indoor cultivation of cannabis. Again, if we sort of focus on somewhere like the US, which is the most mature, well-developed cannabis market by some way, and it's where the bulk of the cultivation, at least in the legal market, is happening currently. And if you look within the US at a state like California, which again is a very mature cannabis state, both in terms of its legacy or what would now be called the black market and the legal market over time. Some estimates there indicate that the cannabis industry accounts for about 3% of total energy use in a state like California, which is a huge state. if you look at somewhere like Colorado, which again is a very mature cannabis market, you're talking about estimates there of about 1.5% of total carbon emissions coming from the industry. So there's no question that this issue is a potentially serious one. And if you scale that up to an international scale, and particularly if you look at, for example, markets in Europe here where we could shortly see legalization happening because of international treaties, markets like Germany probably won't be able to import enough cannabis to supply a recreational market, so they'll have to start growing themselves. And because of the the climate here in Europe that differs a little bit from the Californian climate, we'll probably see most of that production happening indoors. So you can see that when you start to scale up a growing industry, this issue becomes one that's potentially very serious. There is regulation in this area at the state level in the US. So, for example, some of the states require growers to use renewable sources in terms of their energy, or stipulates what lighting intensity they can have in terms of those indoor grows, or stipulates that they need to use LED lights, for example. In California itself, from 2023 onwards, certain types of companies or producers will be required to make carbon offsets alongside their production as well. So there's a lot of regulatory focus here, and it's necessary because of the scale of the problem.
Okay. You also mentioned, when speaking about challenges, waste management, which is, of course, a huge challenge across all FMCG industries. The EU directive on single-use plastics, which came into force in 2021, was extended to cigarette manufacturers to mitigate the impact of discarded cigarette butts. What are the other ways to regulate waste caused by tobacco industry, and particular by non-biodegradable acetate tow filters?
So from a product point of view, the cigarette category is by far the biggest category still within the industry now, even though we're talking about that migration that's happening across from newer formats, or rather from the cigarette into newer formats. The cigarette remains, and particularly by volume, by far the biggest category. So from a product waste perspective, that's where the biggest issue is. And the cigarette butt, as you say, that contains those cellulose acetate tow filters, which are non-biodegradable. When it comes to regulating, I think to address that problem, you've kind of, the options really are on addressing the issue with the consumer or with the producer, or perhaps a combination of both. And what I mean by that is, if you choose to go down the consumer route, you're talking about trying to stop people not from using the product, but from discarding it in a way which is harmful, or which causes litter. So, for example, penalise discarding of butts. And this has happened in Spain, for example, recently, where they've introduced fines for butt littering in certain areas, particularly beaches and so on. That stops people, obviously, from creating litter. It doesn't solve the issue of ultimately where that butt material goes. On the other side, which is the approach that's been taken in the SUP, the Single Use Products Directive, is to make the producer liable for the outcome of use of that type of product. So extended producer responsibility in terms of litter collection, waste management, etc. And I think the logic of that is that it'll create costs for producers that they'll seek to mitigate or defray by using other types of material in the product. Your third option, of course, would to ban the use of acetate tow, cellulose acetate tow outright. And I think something like the directive is probably a precursor to that, or a precursor at least to examining that as a policy option at the EU level. Because yeah, if you ban cellulose acetate filters overnight, I think you'd have an issue with people still needing to get at that product, and probably accessing through the illicit market or the black market, which obviously won't be complying with regulation anyway.
Okay. Are there any alternatives and to replace these non-biodegradable acetate tow filters with some other, more sustainable filters?
Yeah. I think, there are always alternatives to things. The question is whether those alternatives are viable or feasible, from a consumer acceptance point of view or for commercial point of view. I think the problem in particular is that, cellulose acetate tow has a number of advantages. If you look at things like, the neutrality of the taste of the filter, for example, something that's very important to a cigarette consumer. Heat resistance, obviously another important aspect of the composition of a cigarette. Ease of production, cost, crucially as well. And I know we plan to touch on that issue of cost
Mm-hmm.
as well in a moment. So there's a lot of variables there that any alternative needs to be able to kind of at least match closely enough to make them viable. There have been alternatives that have been tried over time. So you have things like, for example, PLA polymer, which is made from sort of vegetable starch. There's also ways of using some of the acetate without, composing it in different ways that doesn't make it as environmental damaging itself. You've got, filters made from other kind of materials as well, like jute and hemp and so on. So uh, paper is currently being used, and there have been some products launched in the European market as well with paper filters. So there is, work that's happening within the industry, and I think we will begin to see, some of these alternatives come through and be commercially viable and be acceptable to consumers. So I would expect to see more and more volumes move into alternatives. Um, but there are some question marks still there around how quickly that can happen and at what scale and so on.
Okay, let's go back to cannabis. How important is waste management in this industry, where we already see ongoing transition, as you mentioned, to new product delivery formats and an increasing number of consumers quite rapidly moving away from traditional flower?
So I think this is one of the emerging issues in the cannabis space. It's not, it's not as significant yet as the energy resource issues with cultivation. Flower remains the largest format. So right now this is not something that's as significant, but it will become increasingly important, I think, over time. It's changing very quickly. I mean, there are some areas, again, to return to California. Um, uh, there are some areas of California where dispensaries are seeing kind of 60 or 70% of their sales going into vapor products, which are obviously a very different kind of product to something organic like flour. And this points to a certain extent to the future of the industry. Now, I'm not saying that vapes are going to be three quarters of the global industry moving forward, but just in terms of that diversification in product format away from flour, which doesn't have those product waste issues to the same extent, I think that's what we would expect to see. So, it's important, I think, that the industry recognizes this as an issue. And I think, again, as we'll perhaps touch on in a moment, we haven't seen maybe enough of that from industry actors to this point. But it's important that they recognize that this is a kind of an issue that's coming down the track, so to speak, and already begin to look at what kind of materials they're using in these infused formats, making those supply chains for those products as sustainable as possible. Putting into place kind of recycling schemes that are effective and that will work. And aren't just kind of a form of greenwashing, effectively, in a way. So it's an issue that's emerging. Not the most significant from a sustainability point of view that's meeting the industry right now, but certainly something that it would be very useful for the industry to get ahead of and begin to prepare for.
Mhm. And what are the current sustainability actions from tobacco and cannabis industry players to address not only waste management, but also other environmental challenges, so they could also meet their sustainability targets?
This is an area where we're seeing a lot of differentiation between the two industries, I think, and I've talked a little bit already about some of the similarities, I guess, between the industries, or commonalities, it might be a better way of putting it. But I think here we're seeing differences, and largely, I would guess, differences because of the stage of development of the industries. Tobacco is a very, very mature industry, a lot of consolidation, big publicly traded corporates, whereas the cannabis side, from a corporate point of view, is much more fragmented, younger companies, etc. I think on the tobacco side, what's notable is that the language and behavior around sustainability is quite robust. There's a real focus there. Um, I think they've seen that that kind of strategic action on sustainability is both a requirement and an opportunity for the tobacco industry if you look from the point of view of what investors are looking for, to a certain extent what their consumers are looking for, and also maybe the potential to address some of that reputational issue around the industry from action on sustainability. So if you look at the targets they have, there are companies that have quite robust, net zero. If you look at sort of carbon emissions net zero by 2030 throughout the entire supply chains, some others slightly more modest in terms of what they're saying they'll do. And similarly on the packaging side, we've got some that are a mix of more measurable, more firm targets, some more aspirational. So you got things like halving of plastic waste from product, targets to have 100% of their packaging be recyclable or reusable within the next sort of 5 to 10 years, right through to some companies who simply just use language around reducing the environmental impact of their products without kind of quantifying what exactly it is they propose to do. And I think that softer that sort of softer type of language is much more redolent of the cannabis industry right now, and there are a couple of reasons for that. I think, as I said, it's a young industry, and that kind of perhaps ESG side of the operation is not as well developed in some of the licensed producers or companies that we're seeing operating in the US space. I think partly it's also a fact that there are other issues from an ESG perspective that are important and perceived to be important in the cannabis industry. So if you look at things like social equity and so on, um, that's where a lot of the focus is within the industry. And you'll see some of these companies talking about ESG and talking solely about things like social equity, access to economic opportunity, um, uh, expungement of criminal records, etc. And all of these things, of course, are important as well. But I think they've taken up um, a lot of the bandwidth within the industry. So again, if you look at the biggest company, and I don't want to pick it out, but one of the biggest uh, licensed producers in Canada, Canopy Growth, talks about having an environmentally conscious approach, but then doesn't really list any sustainability related activity. It also reports on things like energy use and so on. So it's telling you how much energy it's using, but it doesn't set targets to reduce in the same way as some of the tobacco industry would do. Similarly, one of the bigger companies in the US, Curaleaf, has set up a sustainability task force to kind of establish what they call establishing a baseline, but again, not at that point of really talking in concrete terms about the strategy. So I think in this sense, tobacco companies are certainly ahead of the cannabis companies, and there's a lot of work really still to be done on the cannabis side in terms of recognizing that there's an issue there, and really coming to formulate some concrete strategy around addressing that and mitigating those environmental issues.
Mhm. Well, very interesting. We've been talking about regulators, businesses, and as you say, lots of work needs to be done still. What about consumers? What is their role in this process?
When it comes to the consumer, and in the case of both of these industries specifically, I think you know their role really is to show that they care about sustainability. I think it's an open question in many industries, and perhaps particularly in this space, or certainly at least in the case of the tobacco industry, I think there's an open question around whether tobacco consumers care. So I think the role of the consumer here is to, respond to sustainable alternatives when they're being put in front of them, perhaps pay more for those sustainable alternatives, which are likely to be more expensive in most cases. Become aware about the supply chain of the products they're purchasing. And again, perhaps particularly in the case of the cannabis industry, I would guess that there's a lack of awareness amongst cannabis consumers about just how damaging or unsustainable the supply chain of some of the products they're purchasing are. So there's an issue of education here, or willingness to be educated around exactly what the situation is. And if you kind of put all of those things together, having a little bit more awareness amongst the consumer set, and having a consumer set that's willing to act on that, respond to propositions that are being put in front of them, and sort of vote with their wallets in that respect. I mean, that will give the companies the ultimate argument, the ultimate reason to do more, and make those industries more sustainable.
Yeah, you've started talking about price, and according to our data, to Euromonitor's data, price is an extremely important factor for, let's take cigarette consumers. Between 60-70% of them in the US, Canada, most European countries mention price as the most important product feature. So probably it's unlikely that they would be willing to pay much more, although I'm guessing. And we also see that the cost of compliance with sustainability measures, such as the Single-Use Plastic Directive for or indeed voluntary measures, is likely to be passed on to an increasingly price-sensitive consumer base. So what are the ways, if any at all, to create some balance between these more expensive sustainable offerings and also offer affordable prices in, let's take, tobacco industry, especially in the times when the inflation is so high and keeps rising?
This is, I think, a key point, and it'll certainly be difficult. And I think, as you've referenced, there's one of the major trends within the tobacco space is down trading or depremiumization. Consumers really being unwilling to continue to pay more for a product, or at least to kind of buy the more premium offerings in terms of a category that they see getting more and more expensive on a regular basis because of things like excise increases and so on. So there is certainly a difficulty here in asking a tobacco consumer to pay more, not just because of excise and not just because of inflation, but also because of some sustainability activity that's taken place in the supply chain. One approach, which I suspect some manufacturers will take, is kind of to target measures and propositions to particular parts of their portfolio. So, in other words, all when it comes to concern about sustainability, when it comes to willingness to pay more, to action on sustainability, not all tobacco consumers will be equal in that respect. So I think what it's really important for companies to do is to segment their consumers. They're experts at segmenting consumers in all myriad other ways, and this is just another dimension, I think, on which they would need to segment their consumer base and understand exactly where they can place sustainability measures, and also place the cost for sustainability measures where the interest in those measures is highest and the general price sensitivity is lowest. And what you effectively will end up with is that in certain countries, this may even mean that some consumers will effectively be cross-subsidizing others in terms of measures which enhance sustainability. So it may be that some measures will be targeted to particular parts of the portfolio, particular brands, etc., and won't appear in other brands. There may well be other things that they will want to do which will actually appear right through the portfolio, but you'll only see the cost for those, or the incremental price for those being put on certain brands or consumers. So there's definitely an issue here around this, and again, particularly because it's very difficult to communicate with consumers in the tobacco space. So it's going to be really hard to kind of sell the value of, well, even if you take a step back, in certain cases, it's going to be hard to make consumers aware that there are differences in the product that make it more sustainable. and also sell the value of that. So it's something that the industry is going to have to think really carefully about.
Communication, education, and other things. So to wrap up our conversation, not even discussion, let's talk about the future. So what actions and commitments related to environmental sustainability need to be taken now by the tobacco and cannabis industry players so they are successful in the future? Successful, and I would add sustainable in the future.
Indeed. So the common theme here really is addressing the reality of the situation, and I also think accepting, or as part of that, addressing the reality, accepting that kind of the industry themselves will either make changes voluntarily or they'll be pushed into doing so by that combination of consumers and regulators that we've touched on. So on the tobacco side, the largest questions really in the future are going to be around product waste, I think. So whether you're talking about that cigarette butt question, or whether you're talking about some of those emerging nicotine formats, which bring with them kind of different kinds of sustainability problems. It's really about looking at alternatives, understanding where those alternatives can be brought to the market as soon as possible, different materials, and so on. So, the sooner from a product point of view the tobacco industry can begin to address that question, I think the better in terms of sustainability in the longer term. And then on the cannabis side, as we've discussed, it's perhaps a bit of a honeymoon period right now, I think, for the cannabis industry, because they're benefiting from that perception of being an eco-friendly, more natural type of an offering. I think that consumer awareness still is a little bit lower around really the impact of the problem. It's also probably lower among some regulators as well. So there's a little bit of time now for the industry to come to that realization about the scale of the issue, which again will become only larger as the industry expands into an international one. So, it's a question of looking at what measures they can take to make sure that things like indoor cultivation is as sustainable as it possibly can be, and that goes to all those things we've talked about in terms of renewable sources of energy and recycling of materials and all of that sort of thing. We also have some innovation that's happening in the background within the industry. So one of the most interesting trends, I think, on the production side in the cannabis space is synthetic or biosynthetic production of cannabinoids, which removes entirely effectively that need for a kind of agricultural supply chain. And that obviously would solve or address a lot of problems in terms of the environmental impact. There are also potentially some synergies with the tobacco space as well in terms of things like vapor technology. So to the extent that we can get different materials into things like vapor products, or look at the type of materials that are being used in those newer formats like cannabis beverages and so on, again, the earlier you can address that, the earlier you can get those kinds of solutions to scale and address any issues with cost and so on, the better.
Oh, thank you very much. And thank you for joining me today to discuss this very interesting and very important topic. I hope our listeners enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. While our newest report on environmental sustainability regulation, a cross-industry view, provides many more insights on regulatory environment across major FMCG industries, Euromonitor International sustainability solutions go beyond regulations, bringing together expertise from across our business to help you create effective sustainability strategies, analyze competitors' products with sustainability claims, and many more. Please contact us for more data-driven insights on sustainability@euromonitor.com.